when a wealthy, arrogant neighbor constantly mocked a flooded, swampy depression on the property of a quiet 65-year-old farmer named Chester Hayes, calling it a disgusting mosquito pit, the old man did not get angry. Instead of selling that worthless piece of land for pennies, Chester quietly backed his old tractor to the edge of the mud and dumped thousands of cheap catfish fingerlings straight into the black water. The entire town laughed at him. But 4 years later, the massive harvest that Chester pulled out of that exact same mosquito pit did not just completely crush the arrogance of his wealthy neighbor. It generated a massive pile of cash that left the entire county absolutely speechless. Let me take you back to the spring of 1988, because you need to understand the absolute arrogance of the man living next door to truly appreciate this story. Chester Hayes owned a modest 80-acre farm that bordered the massive, sprawling estate of Vernon Sterling. Vernon was a wealthy, aggressive land developer who bought shiny new tractors entirely on credit and looked down on anyone who wore muddy boots. The absolute dividing line between their two properties was a 2-acre sunken swamp on Chester's land. It was constantly filled with stagnant water, thick green algae, and thousands of buzzing insects. One humid afternoon, Vernon drove his spotless, brand new pickup truck right across the property line. He loudly complained that Chester's disgusting mosquito pit was completely ruining the property value of his $1-million estate. Vernon pulled a thin stack of cash from his pocket and threw it directly onto the hood of Chester's rusted tractor. He offered to buy the swamp for absolute pennies, claiming he would drain it and fill it with clean dirt. Chester did not even touch the money. He calmly wiped his grease-covered hands on a rag and politely refused the insulting offer. Vernon immediately lost his temper. He aggressively pointed his finger at the quiet farmer, calling him a foolish old man who was stubbornly holding onto a worthless pile of disease-filled mud. Vernon stormed back to his shiny truck and sped away, leaving a thick cloud of dust. He thought Chester was just another poor, stubborn farmer making a terrible financial decision, but he had absolutely no idea what the old man was secretly planning to do with that muddy water. Let me tell you exactly what a man with absolute patience and a rusted tractor can do with a worthless piece of land. The very next morning, Chester drove his old farmall down to the edge of the swamp. He did not hire an expensive excavation crew, and he absolutely did not borrow any money from the local bank. Using nothing but a rusted rear blade and slow, steady mechanical torque, he spent 2 solid weeks dragging the thick black mud out of the depression. He deepened the center of the pit and cut a small, narrow trench to connect the stagnant water to a fresh, clear stream that ran along the far edge of his property. Suddenly, the mosquito pit was not a stagnant swamp anymore. It was a proper 2-acre pond with fresh, flowing water. But Chester was not finished. A few days later, a rusty transport truck from a local hatchery backed up to the edge of the water. Chester had spent exactly $200 of his own carefully saved cash to buy thousands of tiny, cheap catfish fingerlings. He ran a thick plastic pipe from the truck directly into the water and let the tiny fish spill into the dark pond. Catfish are incredibly resilient bottom feeders. They do not require expensive, highly formulated commercial fish food. Chester simply fed them the natural agricultural waste from his own operation. Every evening, he would sweep up the cracked corn from his grain bins, collect the leftover alfalfa stalks, and throw the scrap directly into the water. The dark, muddy surface completely hid what was happening below. Now let me pause right here and take you inside the local county diner, because human nature is incredibly predictable when faced with something it does not understand. The diner was the absolute center of local gossip, and Vernon Sterling held court there every single morning. He would sit in the biggest booth drinking hot coffee and loudly entertaining the other wealthy landowners with cruel stories about his neighbor. Vernon laughed and told the entire room that Chester had completely lost his mind. He proudly announced that the old farmer was throwing perfectly good corn into a swamp just to feed pet mosquitoes. The entire diner would erupt in mocking laughter. They placed cruel bets on how long it would take for the stubborn old man to go completely bankrupt. They called him a foolish dinosaur who was blindly throwing his money straight into the mud. But Chester completely ignored the noise of the town. He never defended himself, and he never tried to explain his plan to anyone. While Vernon was busy buying expensive new machinery entirely on credit to impress his wealthy friends, Chester was quietly walking down to his pond every single evening at dusk. He would stand on the muddy bank, listening to the water boil and churn as thousands of hungry mouths broke the surface to eat the scrap corn. He knew exactly what he was building, and he was perfectly willing to let the arrogant men laugh until the harvest arrived. Let me tell you about what happens when you leave a biological gold mine completely alone in the dark for 4 solid years. From 1988 to 1992, Vernon Sterling did exactly what arrogant men always do when they mistake borrowed money for actual wealth. He aggressively expanded. He signed massive high-interest loans at the local bank to buy shiny new combine harvesters and enormous green tractors that he absolutely did not need. He strutted around the county diners acting like an absolute king while completely ignoring the crushing weight of the debt hanging directly over his head. During those exact same 4 years, Chester Hayes lived an entirely debt-free and quiet life. Every single evening, just as the sun dipped below the tree line, Chester would walk down to the edge of the muddy pond. He did not install expensive aeration equipment, and he did not buy commercial formulated fish food. He just carried heavy white buckets of cracked corn and leftover alfalfa scrap, throwing it directly into the dark water. The town was still laughing at him, but nobody could see what was actually happening beneath the murky surface. They could not see that those tiny, cheap fingerlings were feeding voraciously in the warm, shallow mud, completely transforming agricultural waste into pure, heavy muscle. Catfish are incredibly efficient bottom feeders, and Chester's pond had accidentally become an absolute biological paradise for them. They grew into massive, prehistoric-looking monsters, gliding silently through the black water, waiting for the harvest. Then, in the early summer of 1992, the commercial food market completely flipped upside down in a way nobody predicted. A severe, sustained drought had absolutely devastated the massive commercial fish farms down in the southern states, causing a sudden catastrophic shortage across the entire country. The massive seafood processing plants up in the major cities were suddenly facing empty production lines. Desperate commercial buyers from Chicago and St. Louis began driving out into the rural Midwestern counties, frantically searching for any fresh alternative supply. They were offering absolutely unprecedented premium cash prices for fresh, local fish just to keep their factory doors open. Vernon Sterling did not pay any attention to this sudden market shift because arrogant men only care about their own specific problems, and his debt payments were finally starting to choke his farm. But Chester Hayes was quietly listening to the morning agricultural radio broadcast while drinking his black coffee. He knew the absolute perfect moment had finally arrived. He drove his old rusted pickup truck into town, walked into the county feed store, and made one single phone call from the public payphone to a commercial seafood buyer up in the city. He told the desperate buyer that he had a fully stocked 2-acre pond ready for immediate extraction. Let me tell you about the morning of the harvest, because it was the exact moment Vernon Sterling's entire arrogant worldview completely collapsed. It was a Tuesday morning in late June of 1992. Vernon was standing on his expensive, custom-built porch drinking his premium coffee and actively worrying about the massive bank loan payment due at the end of the month. Suddenly, he heard the heavy grinding sound of commercial diesel engines. He looked across the property line and saw 6 enormous refrigerated transport trucks rolling slowly down Chester Hayes' muddy gravel driveway. Vernon immediately assumed his foolish older neighbor was finally going bankrupt and that the bank was arriving to seize his rusted equipment. He put down his coffee, walked aggressively across the property line, and prepared to gloat. But when he reached the edge of the Mosquito pit, he stopped dead in his tracks. The transport drivers were absolutely not bankers. They were commercial seafood buyers from Chicago, and they were frantically unrolling massive heavy-duty netting across the dark water. Chester Hayes stood quietly on the bank, wearing his usual worn overalls and holding a simple wooden clipboard. He did not look like a man losing his farm. He looked exactly like a man about to cash a winning lottery ticket. Vernon aggressively pushed his way through the workers and demanded to know what was going on. He loudly reminded everyone that the muddy swamp was a worthless, disease-filled pit. Chester did not answer him. He simply nodded to the foreman of the transport crew. The heavy diesel winches on the trucks engaged, and the massive nets began to pull tight across the pond. For a moment, the dark water was completely still. Then the surface absolutely exploded. Now let me pause here and ask you to picture the sheer biological mass of thousands of fully grown, bottom-feeding catfish thrashing simultaneously in shallow water. The water boiled with heavy gray muscle and thick whiskers. These were not the tiny, cheap fingerlings Chester had dumped into the mud 4 years ago. These were massive, prehistoric-looking monsters, completely fattened on 4 solid years of agricultural waste and natural prairie insects. Vernon Sterling's jaw physically dropped. He watched in absolute stunned silence as the workers began hoisting literal tons of premium fresh fish into the refrigerated trucks. The desperate commercial buyers were practically fighting each other over the yield, offering Chester absolutely unprecedented premium cash prices right there on the muddy bank just to secure the load. By noon, the harvest was entirely complete and the final weight was officially calculated. The lead buyer from Chicago pulled out a heavy corporate checkbook and wrote Chester a check that made Vernon Sterling's eyes go wide with absolute horror. The exact dollar amount was enough to pay for Chester's daughter's entire university medical degree in pure cold cash, with enough left over to buy another 100 acres of prime farmland. Vernon stood frozen in the deep mud. His expensive leather boots were completely ruined. He was currently drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment debt, struggling to pay the crushing interest on his shiny new tractors. He had spent 4 solid years sitting in the local diner, loudly mocking a quiet old man for feeding scrap corn to mosquitoes. But in one single morning, that worthless swamp had just generated more pure liquid profit than Vernon's entire sprawling $1 million estate had produced in 5 long years. Chester folded the massive check, put it into his worn leather wallet, and finally looked directly at his arrogant neighbor. He did not gloat, and he did not raise his voice. He simply thanked Vernon for letting him keep the mosquito pit. Vernon Sterling did not say a single solitary word. He turned around, walked back to his debt-filled estate, and was never heard mocking another farmer ever again.
Let me ask you something. Why do so many people confuse borrowed money with actual wealth? Vernon Sterling had $1 million estate, but he did not actually own any of it. The bank owned his tractors, and the bank owned his land. Chester Hayes owned a worthless mosquito pit, but he owned it free and clear. That is the absolute difference between looking rich and actually being rich. When you are completely free from the crushing weight of monthly bank payments, you have the absolute freedom to be patient. You have the freedom to throw scrap corn into a muddy swamp for 4 solid years and simply wait for the harvest. True wealth is not about what you can aggressively borrow. It is about what you can quietly build from absolutely nothing. Before we finish, I want to share a small secret. While the stubborn, patient spirit of this tale beats loudly in the heart of every rural American town, the specific names and events are a carefully crafted legend. It is a fictional tribute dedicated to the countless debt-free farmers who absolutely refuse to surrender their independence to arrogant neighbors and greedy local banks. If you truly believe that quiet patience will always defeat loud arrogance, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments right now if you have ever turned something totally worthless into something incredibly valuable while everyone else laughed at you. Until next time, always remember that the most valuable treasures are usually hiding exactly where arrogant people refuse to look.